It started with a folded piece of paper tucked under my windshield, the kind that feels heavier than it should. The neighborhood was quiet, the sun low, my driveway silent except for the ticking engine cooling down. One sentence on that notice changed everything I thought I knew about power. It wasn't a warning. It was a command. And whoever wrote it believed they had authority over my property, my car, and my freedom. What they didn't know was that power only works until it meets the wrong person. If you believe stories where entitlement meets accountability, where abuse of power collides with real-world consequences, and where karma shows up without mercy, subscribe now and stay with this story until the very end. The house sat at the far edge of the subdivision, where the sidewalks cracked and the manicured look of the neighborhood quietly unraveled. It had been mine for years, long enough to understand every sound it made at night and every shift in light across the driveway each morning. The Homeowners Association had never liked that house. It was too private, too independent, too unwilling to play along. I didn't attend meetings. I didn't volunteer. I followed the law, paid my taxes, and kept to myself. That was apparently the first offense. The second offense was my vehicle. It wasn't new. It wasn't flashy. But it was registered, insured, and legally parked on my own driveway. To the HOA, that didn't matter. They cared about perception more than reality. They cared about control more than legality. And somewhere along the line, someone decided that my car represented a challenge. The notice under the windshield wasn't from the city. It wasn't from law enforcement. It was printed on HOA letterhead, thick paper meant to look official. It claimed a violation. It demanded immediate compliance. And near the bottom, it stated that the HOA retained access authority through a master key system for the neighborhood. That line lingered. There was no such system. No legal one. No system that allowed an HOA to access private vehicles. But the confidence in that sentence suggested something worse than ignorance. It suggested belief. Over the next few days, things shifted. Security vehicles slowed near my driveway. A clipboard appeared in passing. Someone photographed the car from the street. Every movement felt watched, documented, judged. The neighborhood that once felt boring now felt hostile in its stillness. Then came the second notice. This one was taped to my garage door. It stated that failure to comply would result in corrective action. No explanation. No statute. Just implication. That was when the unease turned into something sharper. Fear doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it creeps in quietly and waits. I started paying closer attention. Tire tracks near the driveway that weren't mine. A faint smear on the driver's side handle, wiped clean but not well enough. Someone had touched the car. That was the moment the line was crossed. The following afternoon, I sat inside with the blinds partially open, watching the driveway reflect heat waves off the pavement. When a white HOA SUV rolled in slowly and stopped near the curb, my chest tightened. The engine idled too long. The passenger door opened. She stepped out like she owned the street. Confident. Unhurried. Carrying a ring of keys that caught the sun when she moved. She walked straight toward my car without looking at the house. No hesitation. No uncertainty. The kind of certainty that only comes from thinking you're untouchable. She reached the driver's side and lifted the key ring. That image burned itself into memory. I moved before she could do anything else, stepping outside just enough to be seen. She froze for a fraction of a second, then squared her shoulders. The keys remained in her hand. She didn't apologize. She didn't retreat. She stood there, believing herself justified. What followed wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. She stepped back and pulled out her phone, already dialing, already confident that authority would be on her side. I watched her expression settle into something smug. The call went through. She pointed once at the car, then at the house, narrating a story she had already rehearsed in her mind. Trespassing turned into enforcement. Unauthorized vehicle turned into compliance issue. And somewhere in that twisted logic, she believed the badge would come for me. I stayed calm. Silent. Because what she didn't know What she couldn't possibly imagine was that I understood exactly how these situations unfold. I had spent years on the other side of those calls. I knew the language. I knew the tone. And I knew when someone was about to learn a lesson they couldn't undo. The sound of approaching sirens arrived sooner than she expected. And when they did, everything she thought she controlled began to slip. The sirens faded as the patrol car turned onto the street, its presence instantly changing the atmosphere. What had been a quiet standoff became something heavier, something official. The HOA vehicle still idled at the curb, its white paint glaring in the afternoon sun, while she stood beside my car with the keys clenched in her hand, posture rigid, chin lifted. She looked ready, rehearsed, certain this moment would end in her favor. I stayed where I was, just inside the shade of my porch, letting the scene breathe. Experience had taught me that rushing never helped. People who misuse authority rely on momentum, on panic, on the assumption that the other side will fold. I had no intention of folding. The patrol car stopped cleanly. Tires crunched on gravel. Doors opened. The air shifted again, thick with expectation. She moved first, striding toward them with purpose, already shaping the story. Her gestures were sharp and practiced, pointing back toward my driveway, framing the car as a problem that required immediate correction. From a distance, she looked convincing. That was her strength. Confidence could masquerade as truth long enough to cause damage. I watched carefully, noting every movement, every detail. The way she kept the keys visible. The way she stood slightly too close to the officers, asserting familiarity. The way she never once glanced back at the house, never acknowledging that this was private property. Her certainty was absolute. The officers listened. That part always came first. Listening didn't mean agreement, but to her it did. Each nod felt like validation. Each second stretched her confidence higher. She spoke with the authority of someone who had never been challenged, someone accustomed to compliance. The first officer finally turned toward me. I stepped forward slowly, hands visible, posture calm. The heat pressed down, heavy and relentless, but my breathing stayed even. I felt none of the nervous energy she expected. Instead, there was clarity. This wasn't confrontation. This was correction. I explained the basics. The car was registered. The driveway was private. No easement. No emergency. No consent. Each detail stripped away part of her narrative, reducing it to what it truly was, unauthorized access justified by imagined power. She reacted immediately. Her stance stiffened. The keys rattled slightly as her grip tightened. She interjected with sweeping claims about HOA authority, master access, community regulations. She spoke quickly, layering words on top of words, hoping complexity would obscure reality. It often worked on people unfamiliar with the law. It didn't work here. The officers asked follow-up questions. Simple ones. Specific ones. The kind that demanded facts instead of assumptions. Documentation. Written authority. Legal basis. Each question chipped away at her composure. The confidence wavered, just enough to reveal irritation beneath it. She insisted the HOA had jurisdiction. She insisted the vehicle violated community standards. She insisted she was within her rights. What she couldn't produce was proof. No statute. No warrant. No authorization. Just printed notices and bravado. That distinction mattered more than she realized. The senior officer's expression changed subtly. Not dramatic. Just a shift, a recalibration. It was the look of someone recognizing overreach. The tone softened toward me and sharpened toward her. Questions became firmer. Clarifications more pointed. The keys came up again. Where did she get them? What were they intended for? Did she believe she could access private vehicles without owner permission? She hesitated. That pause was everything. In it lived doubt, confusion, and the creeping realization that this situation was no longer under her control. She glanced toward the HOA vehicle as if it might rescue her, then back to the officers, searching for alignment that wasn't there anymore. I felt the moment settle. This was where fear usually entered the picture for people like her. Not fear of punishment, but fear of exposure. Of being seen clearly for the first time. She shifted her stance, shoulders tightening, voice rising slightly as she doubled down instead of stepping back. The wrong move. The officers separated the parties. One stayed with her near the curb. The other stepped closer to me, lowering his voice, asking quieter questions. Background. Ownership. Employment. His manner suggested assessment rather than suspicion. I answered honestly. Simply. Then came the question that froze the air. He asked if I wanted to identify myself formally. I did. The recognition didn't hit immediately. It never did. It took a second, sometimes two, for the weight of certain words to register. I watched his eyes as it happened, the slight widening, the pause before the nod. His posture adjusted. Respect layered itself into his stance without effort. Across the driveway, she was still talking. Still insisting. Still unaware. The officer near her turned his head slightly toward his partner. Just a glance. Just enough. Something passed between them that she didn't notice, but I did. A silent recalculation. The energy shifted one last time, decisively. The sunlight reflected off the car windows, sharp and blinding. And for the first time since she stepped onto my property, she looked uncertain. The moment of uncertainty didn't arrive with noise or confrontation. It arrived quietly, settling into the space between her words and the officer's silence. She could feel it slipping, even if she didn't yet understand why. Power, when borrowed instead of earned, always evaporates the same way. Slow enough to deny at first, fast enough to panic over later. The officer standing with her adjusted his stance. Not dramatically. Just enough to indicate distance. Authority creating space rather than accepting intrusion. She noticed. Her shoulders tightened again. The keys, once held like a badge of dominance, now dangled awkwardly from her fingers, catching light in a way that felt suddenly accusatory. The officer with me spoke quietly, deliberately, asking questions that carried weight without force. Years of service taught him how to listen not just to words but to history, to posture, to restraint. I answered without embellishment. No defensiveness. No performance. The truth doesn't need volume. As information exchanged hands, the street seemed to narrow. The neighborhood she believed belonged to her felt smaller, less supportive, stripped of imagined backing. No neighbors emerged. No HOA reinforcements arrived. It was just asphalt, sunlight, and accountability. She began glancing toward the officers more frequently, searching for cues, for reassurance that she was still in charge. Each glance returned nothing. Neutral expressions. Professional distance. The kind that should have warned her to stop talking. She didn't. She escalated instead, raising her voice, repeating claims, insisting that community authority outweighed individual ownership. Each repetition sounded weaker than the last. Her certainty cracked, revealing irritation beneath it, then desperation. People accustomed to obedience struggle when resistance appears calm and immovable. The officer nearest her finally intervened, lifting a hand in a controlled, unmistakable signal. The talking stopped. That silence landed hard. In it, the sound of the idling HOA SUV suddenly felt intrusive, out of place. He asked her to explain again, slowly, why she believed she could access private property without consent. She tried. But stripped of momentum, her explanation collapsed into fragments. Policy references without citation. Assumptions without foundation. The master key concept resurfaced again, now sounding absurd in the open air. The officer asked where the master key applied. She gestured vaguely, as if geography might rescue her claim. It didn't. Vagueness doesn't survive scrutiny. The questions turned sharper. Did she attempt to unlock the vehicle? Did she possess written authorization? Did she understand the distinction between HOA guidelines and state law? Each question forced another step backward. Her confidence visibly drained, replaced by something else entirely. Fear of consequence. Not embarrassment. Consequence. I watched her face as realization dawned. The situation was no longer about compliance or community standards. It was about unauthorized access, about intent, about calling emergency services under false pretenses. The officers exchanged another look. This time, she noticed. Her breathing changed. Faster. Shallower. Her posture sagged slightly, the weight of the moment pressing down. She finally looked toward me, really looked, as if seeing me for the first time not as a problem but as a person she had misjudged. That look carried something close to disbelief. People like her assume power has a look, a uniform, a title. They don't expect it to stand quietly on a porch, patient and unreactive, letting the system do what it is meant to do. The officer with me spoke again, his tone respectful but firm. He clarified the situation aloud, summarizing facts as they stood. Ownership confirmed. No violation present. No authority granted. No legal justification for the actions taken. Each sentence felt like a door closing. Her response came too late. She attempted to backtrack, softening claims, reframing intentions as misunderstandings. The shift was obvious. Control had been replaced by damage control. It never looks dignified. The keys were the final detail. The officer asked her to hand them over temporarily. The request was calm, procedural, unavoidable. Her hand trembled slightly as she complied. Metal clicked softly as the keys left her grasp. That sound echoed louder than it should have. The symbol of her assumed authority reduced to an object, weighed, assessed, and questioned. The HOA SUV engine shut off. For the first time since she arrived, the street felt quiet again. The officer explained consequences in neutral terms. No accusations. No threats. Just reality. Unauthorized attempt. Improper use of emergency services. Trespass concerns. Each phrase landed with precision. She nodded repeatedly, too quickly, agreeing with everything now, hoping agreement might undo what had already happened. It couldn't. I stood still, absorbing none of it emotionally. This wasn't vindication. It was inevitability. Systems work when patience outlasts arrogance. One of the officers asked her to step aside. She did. And in that movement, something fundamental shifted. The world she controlled shrank to the edge of the curb. The rest of it moved on without her. The officer turned back toward me, offering a brief update, a courtesy rooted in mutual understanding. His expression carried acknowledgement now, not suspicion. Behind us, she stood alone. And she finally understood that calling 911 had not summoned help for her, it had summoned the truth. The truth has a weight to it that settles slowly, pressing down once there is nowhere left to run. She stood near the curb now, smaller somehow, her earlier certainty drained away until all that remained was posture without purpose. The officers moved with calm efficiency, the kind that comes from having seen this pattern before. Abuse of authority always follows the same arc: confidence, overreach, exposure, collapse. The neighborhood felt different in that moment. The sidewalks, the trimmed hedges, the identical mailboxes all seemed less polished, as if the illusion of order had cracked. The HOA thrived on appearances, on the idea that control created safety. But control without legitimacy always curdled into something darker. The officer nearest me took notes, methodical and unhurried. Each movement conveyed that this situation mattered, that it would not be brushed aside or minimized. Across the driveway, the other officer continued documenting her actions, the vehicle, the location, the attempted access. Every detail stripped away another layer of protection she thought the HOA provided. She watched them write. Writing scares people like her more than raised voices ever could. Paper creates permanence. It outlives excuses. The longer the officers worked, the more her composure unraveled. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, arms crossing and uncrossing, eyes darting toward passing cars that never slowed. No witnesses came forward to support her version of events. No neighbors rushed out to defend the HOA's authority. Silence offered no allies. The realization sank in fully now. She was alone. The officer finished his notes and stepped back, reviewing the information one last time before continuing. The pause stretched. She filled it with nervous movements, smoothing her hair, adjusting her clothing, rehearsing apologies that never quite formed. The situation had outgrown her. What began as a power play over a parked vehicle had transformed into a documented misuse of authority, an attempted intrusion, and a false emergency call. Each element compounded the next, stacking consequences she hadn't anticipated. The officers began explaining next steps, not dramatically, not cruelly, but clearly. Explanation isn't mercy. It's precision. It ensures there can be no confusion later, no claims of ignorance or misunderstanding. She nodded along again, but this time slower, heavier, like someone carrying a burden they finally recognized. Her HOA credentials meant nothing now. The car remained untouched, exactly where it had always been. The driveway stood firm, indisputably private. Reality, once clarified, refuses to bend back into illusion. I remained where I was, present but uninvolved. Years in law enforcement had taught me restraint. Let the process work. Let arrogance defeat itself. There is no need to gloat when truth does the job cleanly. The officer with the keys returned them, but not casually. The motion was deliberate, accompanied by a reminder of boundaries and consequences. Objects regain their harmlessness when their symbolism collapses. She accepted them with both hands this time. The power they once represented was gone. The officers spoke briefly together, confirming documentation, timelines, and reporting procedures. Their coordination was seamless, professional. This would not be forgotten the moment they drove away. This would follow a path, one she could no longer intercept. The HOA vehicle became another focal point. Its presence, once assertive, now felt misplaced. A private organization's logo gleamed uselessly in the sunlight, stripped of authority. The line between governance and control had been redrawn, visibly and irrevocably. She stepped back again, increasing the distance between herself and my property, as though physical space could undo legal error. The curb marked her new boundary, one she would not cross again today. For the first time, she looked genuinely uncertain of what came next. Uncertainty is what happens when people who rely on unchecked power face structure. It forces reflection, fear, and eventually restraint. Whether that restraint would last remained to be seen. The officers finished their assessment. One approached me to conclude the interaction, ensuring everything necessary had been documented and that no further action was needed from my end. It was procedural, respectful, final. Behind him, she waited. She no longer tried to assert control or argue authority. She simply stood there, absorbing the outcome, shoulders slumped under the weight of accountability. The patrol car's engine started. That sound marked the true end of the encounter. Not resolution, but transition. Consequences had been set in motion, and their momentum no longer belonged to any one person. As the officers prepared to leave, they took one last look at the scene, committing it to memory. Quiet neighborhood. Private driveway. HOA official standing at the edge of her influence. Everything in its place. The patrol car pulled away slowly, siren silent, purpose fulfilled. The street returned to stillness. But the stillness felt different now. Heavier. Charged with what had just occurred. Power had been tested and corrected, not through force, but through clarity. She lingered for a moment longer, perhaps hoping something might change, that someone might reverse the outcome. Nothing did. Finally, she turned back toward the HOA vehicle. Each step away from my driveway felt deliberate, reluctant. Every footfall carried the weight of miscalculation. She paused once, glancing back, not with anger, but with something closer to disbelief. The car door closed. The engine started. And as the HOA vehicle pulled away, I knew this wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The days that followed carried a different kind of tension, the quiet aftermath that settles in after power shifts hands. The driveway looked the same. The car sat unmoved. The house remained unchanged. But the atmosphere around the neighborhood felt strained, like a held breath that hadn't yet been released. When authority is exposed, everyone senses the aftershock, even those pretending not to. News travels fast in controlled communities. Not officially, not through emails or notices, but through glances, pauses, and changes in behavior. HOA patrols slowed near my street more cautiously now. Clipboards appeared less frequently. Cameras that once lingered turned away more quickly. The machine still existed, but it hesitated. Silence from the HOA followed. No follow-up notice. No violation letter. No warning. That absence spoke louder than any threat ever had. Organizations built on control struggle most when forced into restraint. They don't apologize. They retreat and regroup. I didn't push. I didn't call meetings or demand explanations. I waited. Waiting is often mistaken for weakness, but it's usually preparation. Midweek, a sealed envelope arrived in my mailbox, heavier than ordinary mail, official without being dramatic. Inside were copies of documentation, incident reports, reference numbers, neutral language outlining what had occurred, what had been observed, and what actions were under review. No emotion. Just facts preserved in ink. Seeing it in writing confirmed what I already knew. The moment wasn't temporary. It had been recorded. The HOA board convened quietly a few days later. I knew because the parking lot filled in the evening, cars arriving earlier than usual, staying later than planned. No announcement reached me. I didn't need one. Bodies gathering meant damage control. Inside those walls, narratives were being rewritten. Blame redirected. Responsibility diluted. That is how organizations attempt survival after exposure. Someone becomes expendable so the structure can pretend integrity remains intact. Her name never appeared publicly, but her absence became noticeable. The white HOA SUV stopped patrolling the neighborhood. A different vehicle replaced it, unmarked, less assertive. The rhythm of enforcement changed, softened, as if afraid to be noticed. Fear had entered the system, not of residents, but of consequences. Neighbors behaved differently around me now. Some avoided eye contact. Others lingered longer during brief conversations, curious but cautious. No one asked questions directly. They didn't need answers. They wanted confirmation. Confirmation that resistance was possible. That authority wasn't absolute. Power thrives on the belief that no one will challenge it. That belief had been broken. Toward the end of the week, another envelope arrived. This one bore HOA branding, but the tone had shifted entirely. Where past notices commanded, this one suggested. Where language once implied enforcement, it now referenced cooperation. Legal review. Clarification of policy. Future updates forthcoming. It was carefully written. Too carefully. Every word had been weighed by someone afraid of repeating a mistake. Someone had clearly advised them to proceed slowly, cautiously, and with respect they had never shown before. Fear does that. It makes institutions polite. The letter mentioned community harmony, transparency, respect for property rights. It mentioned none of what actually happened. That omission was intentional. Admitting fault would validate precedent. Instead, they attempted a reset, hoping to move forward without accountability. That was expected. Most systems protect themselves before they protect people. But the record already existed elsewhere. Documentation doesn't forget just because organizations wish it would. Days later, I noticed something else. The HOA's online portal updated quietly. Language changed. Sections rewritten. The Access Authority clause disappeared entirely. Master key references vanished. What once stood as implied control was erased without explanation. Revisions are admissions without apology. Someone had learned. The silence stretched into a week, then two. Life resumed its outward normalcy, but the undercurrent remained. I knew the matter wasn't closed. Review processes take time. Complaints move through channels slowly but relentlessly. Accountability rarely announces itself early. Then came the call. Not from the HOA. From a number I recognized, one tied to official lines and procedural follow-ups. The tone was measured, professional, confirming details already known. Clarifying timelines. Verifying statements. Ensuring consistency. There was no hostility in the questions. Only diligence. They thanked me for patience. Patience is what allows systems to reveal their outcomes. Another week passed. The neighborhood board announced an internal restructuring during a meeting few attended. Committees realigned. Oversight expanded. Training mandated. Language like preventative measures and risk mitigation filled the agenda. Her role was never mentioned. But she did not return. The absence confirmed everything words would not. The HOA's authority hadn't vanished, but it had been reshaped, curtailed, placed under scrutiny. Control now carried risk. Enforcement required justification. The quiet confidence of unchecked power was gone. One evening, as I stood in the driveway beside the car that had started it all, I considered how close the situation had come to going wrong. How often it likely had for others who lacked knowledge, patience, or protection. The thought lingered longer than expected. This wasn't just about me. It never had been. The story had reached beyond one driveway, one vehicle, one individual. It had shifted a balance, however slightly, toward accountability. And while the neighborhood returned to its routines, something irreversible had changed beneath the surface. Because once authority is forced to look at itself clearly, it never feels as comfortable again. And consequences, even delayed ones, were still unfolding. Time has a way of finishing what confrontation begins. Weeks turned into a month, and the neighborhood settled into a new normal that only looked ordinary on the surface. The sidewalks were still swept. Lawns still trimmed. HOA emails still arrived with cheerful subject lines and carefully neutral language. But underneath it all, the tone had changed. Control had been replaced with caution, and caution is always louder than silence. The incident faded from casual conversation, but it never truly disappeared. It lingered in policy revisions, in modified patrol routes, in the sudden emphasis on legal review for even minor actions. Every system leaves fingerprints when it learns a hard lesson. This one was no different. I never heard from her again. No apology. No explanation. No quiet attempt to smooth things over. People who rely on authority often struggle to exist once it's stripped away. Without it, there's nothing left to defend. Her disappearance wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. The cleanest kind of removal. Effective and permanent. The HOA's tone continued to soften. Notices began referencing state law instead of community rules. Language shifted toward requests instead of violations. Enforcement windows lengthened. Appeals were openly encouraged. What once felt oppressive now felt restrained, almost fragile. That fragility mattered. Neighbors began testing boundaries in small ways. A trailer parked overnight. A fence modification left standing a few days longer than usual. Nothing reckless, just subtle explorations. Each unchallenged moment reinforced what people were already sensing. The grip had loosened. I noticed more waves. More nods. A few careful conversations initiated by others instead of avoided. The story had spread, not through details, but through outcome. HOA overreach had met a wall, and the wall hadn't moved. That was the real impact. True power isn't loud. It doesn't posture. It doesn't announce itself with keys or clipboards or threats tucked under windshield wipers. It stands quietly, rooted in legality and patience, waiting for overconfidence to make the mistake it always makes. One afternoon, months later, a new HOA representative stopped near my driveway. Not to inspect. Not to enforce. Just to inform. The interaction was brief, respectful, and carefully documented on their end. No assumptions. No entitlement. Just professionalism. It felt almost surreal. The same driveway that once served as a stage for arrogance now symbolized restraint. The same car once targeted now sat untouched, unremarkable, just another vehicle among many. That transformation carried weight far beyond appearances. I never celebrated the outcome. There was no satisfaction in watching a system retreat, only relief. Relief that it had been corrected before causing irreversible harm. Relief that knowledge and patience had been enough. Too often, they aren't. The incident reinforced something I already understood but rarely saw play out so cleanly. When people misuse power, they rely on fear to keep others compliant. Remove fear, replace it with clarity, and the entire structure begins to wobble. The 911 call had been her final mistake. Emergency systems don't care about titles or associations. They respond to facts. They document actions. They preserve truth in a form that doesn't bend to ego. Once involved, the story belongs to reality, not the person who initiated it. That reality had followed its course. The HOA board eventually announced new training requirements for all representatives. Legal boundaries were emphasized. Interaction protocols rewritten. Oversight introduced where none existed before. Each change quietly acknowledged the same thing without saying it outright. Unchecked authority had failed. Life returned to routine, but it was a healthier routine. Less tension. Fewer confrontations. More space to exist without scrutiny. It wasn't perfect, but it was improved. Sometimes that's the best outcome justice offers. Standing in the driveway one evening as the sun dipped low, I reflected on how easily things could have gone differently if I had reacted emotionally instead of methodically. If I had raised my voice. If I had argued instead of waited. If I had tried to overpower arrogance instead of letting it collapse under its own weight. The lesson stayed with me. Power doesn't belong to those who claim it. It belongs to those who understand its limits. That day, a set of keys lost its meaning. A title lost its shield. And an organization learned that authority, when misused, invites consequences it cannot control. The neighborhood never returned to what it was before. It became something better. Quieter. Fairer. More grounded in reality than appearance. And while most residents might never know the full story, they lived with its outcome every day. Justice didn't arrive with sirens. It arrived with documentation, patience, and the wrong person underestimating the consequences of crossing the wrong driveway.